Under the gaslit skies of Bordeaux, 1854, a quiet townhouse trembles with ruin. A daughter learns her father's debt carries an unthinkable price, her honor bartered in silence to a ruthless creditor. One carriage waits, one door closes, and in the hush before midnight a stranger steps from the shadows, setting fate on a knife's edge between duty and desire. A secret is about to be named. A past is about to return, and a single choice will redraw the boundaries of love, dignity, and power. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and one question: in period romances, what moves you most? Forbidden love, redemption, or second chances? Bordeaux, France. The spring of 1854 breathed life into the vineyards that curved around the rolling hills. Yet in the heart of the city, beneath the soot-kissed roofs and behind the lace-curtained windows of Rue de l'Amiral, the air was thick with ruin. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers, through closed doors, in the trembling of hands, in the silence that falls after a knock that goes unanswered. The Marchand townhouse, once a symbol of quiet bourgeois prosperity, now bore the weight of shame like ivy on crumbling stone. The wallpaper peeled along the edges. The once polished parquet floors had dulled with neglect. And in the dim parlor, with its tattered damask drapes drawn against the afternoon sun, Iseline Marchand stood motionless, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the settee, as if to ground herself in the face of a truth too cruel to absorb. Her father sat across from her, his figure collapsed into the threadbare armchair that had once been his place of authority. The brandy in his glass had long since been watered by remorse. His cravat hung askew. His greying hair clung to his forehead with the sweat of shame. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and evasive. "I had no choice, ma fille. They were going to seize everything. The house, the books, even the silver." Iseline's hazel-green eyes, usually soft and full of quiet wonder, now burned with disbelief. She had known, of course. The signs had been there. The sleepless nights, the closed accounts, the sudden visits from stone-faced men in well-tailored coats. But this was not ruin. This was degradation. "You gambled my dowry," she said at last, her voice calm but taut, like silk pulled across a blade. Victor Marchand bowed his head. "It was never my intention, but I made a mistake, and Armand de Fleur is not a man one refuses." The name fell like ice into the room. De Fleur, a merchant fattened by the misfortunes of others, his fortune built not on noble trade, but on cunning, cruelty, and the suffering of desperate men. His letters had arrived days before, veiled in civility, but explicit in threat. The debt would be cleared. In return, Iseline would belong to him for one night. She stood slowly, her breath shallow. Her gown of soft grey wool clung to her slender form with modest elegance. It had once been adorned with mother-of-pearl buttons. Two were missing now. Her long chestnut hair had been braided and coiled at the nape of her neck that morning by her younger sister, who had giggled, without knowing this would be their last moment together for some time. "I will go," she said, and her father looked up in astonishment. "No, Iseline, you never meant for any of this. And yet here we are." She did not raise her voice. She did not weep, but her hands trembled as she gathered her gloves and her faded cloak. She crossed the parlor and paused beside the small table where a miniature portrait of her late mother sat. She touched the frame. "I will not let them take the children. I will not let our name rot in the mouths of gossips. If one night is the price for their peace, then so be it." Victor wept then, silently, his face in his hands. She did not comfort him. Later, with dusk folding over the city like a veil of mourning, Iseline stood before the mirror in her bedroom for the last time as a woman untouched by disgrace. She removed her cross pendant and tucked it into her mother's locket, pressing it to her chest. Her reflection looked back at her with a defiant calm that did not belong to the girl she had been the day before. Outside, The street lamps flickered into life, casting golden halos onto the cobblestones. Her boots echoed faintly as she descended the stairs. The housekeeper's daughter, young Thérèse, met her at the door. "Will you be late, mademoiselle?" Iseline smiled faintly. "No later than fate allows." She left her siblings in the care of the neighbor widow Dupré, offering a purse of the last few coins she possessed. Then she turned toward the waiting carriage that had been sent by Defleur, its driver stone-faced and silent. She stepped in without a word. As the wheels turned and the streets of Bordeaux blurred past the window, Iseline gripped the edge of the seat, willing herself not to cry. She would not cry. She thought of her mother's lullabies, of her siblings' laughter, of the weight of her family's honor, now resting not in gold or name, but in her body. And yet somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and the humiliation, there was something else. A stillness, a spark, a whisper that told her, "You are not broken, not yet." The carriage turned a corner, and the silhouette of the house loomed ahead, tall, cold, expectant. Tonight she would face the lion's den, and if her soul remained intact, it would be by the grace of her will alone. What she did not yet know, what the stars themselves held close and silent, was that the night would not unfold as planned. Not even Defleur would expect what waited in the shadows. The carriage rolled deeper into the outskirts of Bordeaux, where the gaslights faded and the stone facades gave way to long alleys flanked by closed shutters and secrets. The night had thickened into something tangible, an embrace of shadows and unspoken dread. Iseline sat stiffly across from the coachman's broad back, her gloved hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing darkness. She had spoken not a word since the ride began, and he had not asked for one. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was loaded, like a pistol in a gentleman's drawer. As the wheels slowed, Iseline caught her first glimpse of the house. It was not a brothel, as some might have whispered, nor a tavern cloaked in vice. It was a private residence, a townhouse nestled at the corner of a quiet street near the Quai Sainte-Croix. Discreet, elegant, detached from judgment, and that made it more dangerous. The door opened before she could knock. A man in livery greeted her with a nod, offering no smile, no kindness. She followed him through a narrow hall, paneled in dark wood, past a staircase that spiraled upward like a winding secret, until they reached a drawing room bathed in amber lamplight. There he was, Armand Defleur. He rose from a velvet armchair, his silhouette heavy, round, and unmistakably self-satisfied. His frock coat was bottle green, his waistcoat embroidered in gold. A ruby winked from his cravat pin. His moustache gleamed with wax, and his cologne, sharp and opulent, saturated the air before he spoke a single word. "Mademoiselle Marchand," he purred, spreading his arms as though welcoming an honored guest. "You've come after all. I confess I half expected your sense of pride to delay you." Iseline did not answer. She did not curtsy. Her spine remained straight, her chin lifted, her silence deliberate. Defleur chuckled. "Ah, the noble silence, a fine choice. Come," he gestured to the chaise near the fire. "I have brandy, or would you prefer wine? Something from your family's former connections, perhaps." Still she did not move. Her heart thudded in her chest, slow and powerful like a distant drum. "I assume your father explained the arrangement," he continued, walking toward the liquor cabinet, his back to her. "One night, discretion assured, and in exchange, a clean slate. Your siblings will never know. The neighbors will forget the shame. And you, mademoiselle, you will have done your duty, quietly, beautifully." He turned with a glass in hand, his eyes landing on her bodice with a gaze that felt like smoke seeping through a crack in the door. "You're even lovelier than I remembered." That was the moment Iseline felt it. Not rage, not fear, but nausea. She opened her mouth at last, not to protest, not to plead, but to breathe, a single breath, steady and sharp, like the intake of air before diving into cold water. But before the next breath came, a sound echoed through the house, a door closing firmly. Desfleur frowned. The butler reappeared in the corridor, uncertain. Then a second figure stepped forward, taller, darker, leaner. His footsteps were deliberate, measured, as if each step had already been weighed and chosen long before he arrived. He did not knock, he did not greet. He entered as one with every right to intrude. Etienne Carrière. The name had passed through Bordeaux lips for years, usually softened by pity or reverence. The widowed vintner, the man who lived with ghosts. But now, in this room heavy with firelight and tension, he was not a recluse. He was not a myth. He was presence. His coat was dark, his gloves removed, one hand gripping a small leather pouch, worn at the edges but firm in his grasp. His gaze traveled from Desfleur to Iseline and back again, pausing only long enough to register everything. Her stillness, the flicker of discomfort in Desfleur's eyes, the glass in his hand. "I came," Etienne said, his voice low, steady, unmistakably controlled, "to settle a debt." Desfleur narrowed his eyes. "This is not your affair." Etienne tossed the pouch onto the table with quiet finality. It landed with a soft thud. Coins shifted within. Iseline did not understand. Her breath caught. Her fingers curled tighter around the edge of her shawl. Desfleur glanced at the pouch, then back at the man before him. "You believe you can purchase my agreement like a barrel of wine? This is a private matter." Etienne's tone darkened. "You've mistaken her desperation for consent. I am here to correct that." The air in the room trembled, as though every object, every book, every flame, every velvet drape held its breath. Desfleur took a step closer, jaw tight. "She came of her own volition. She came because you left her no other path." Desfleur's lip curled. "And what are you, her savior? A man who speaks to vines more than people, the ghost of a dead marriage." The insult was deliberate. The sting meant to provoke. But Etienne did not flinch. Instead, he turned toward Iseline. And in that moment, under the full weight of her uncertainty, her shame, her exhaustion, he looked at her with no pity, no judgment, only clarity. "Do you wish to stay, mademoiselle?" It was not a command. It was not a plea. It was the first time that night someone had offered her a choice, and that choice became her liberation. She swallowed. Her lips parted, and though her voice was barely more than a whisper, it carried enough strength to fracture the silence. "No." Etienne nodded once. Then to Desfleur, "The sum is more than fair. You will accept it, and you will say nothing." Desfleur hesitated. Fury burned in his small grey eyes, but calculation soon followed. He would not win tonight. Not with Etienne Carrière's money on the table and Iseline's refusal so clearly declared. He downed the rest of his brandy and turned toward the window, saying nothing. Etienne stepped forward and extended his arm. Iseline looked at it, at the fine linen of his sleeve, at the veins along his wrist, and then at his face. There were no promises in his expression, no gentleness, only gravity and a strange, silent understanding. A man who knew what it meant to carry sorrow without breaking. She placed her hand on his arm, and together, without a word, they walked from the house. The street outside had grown colder. The mist from the Garonne clung to the stone walls like memory. The carriage that waited was not grand. It bore the dust of a vineyard road, but it welcomed her with the warmth of reprieve. She sat beside Etienne in silence as the carriage pulled away. Neither spoke. Neither looked at the other. But in the space between them, something unspoken settled. Not comfort. Not yet, but perhaps dignity restored. Behind them, the gaslight in Desfleur's house flickered once, then went out. And in the quiet that followed, Bordeaux exhaled. The morning mist clung to the hills of Bordeaux like a secret refusing to lift. The road twisted through fields, still damp with dew, bordered by neat rows of bare vines awaiting spring's full arrival. Beyond them, as the carriage climbed the final bend, the estate emerged. Austere, elegant, and solitary. Chateau Carrière stood like a sentinel of time, its limestone walls pale and time-worn, its shutters drawn tight against the chill of the season. It was not grand in the Parisian sense, but it bore the quiet pride of land passed through generations. Here, the air did not carry the scent of perfume or ink, but of damp soil, fresh timber, and the earthy promise of grapes not yet born. As the carriage halted before the main entrance, Iseline braced herself. She wore her most practical dress, a muted shade of slate-blue wool, its hem slightly frayed, its collar trimmed in simple lace. A modest cloak shielded her from the crisp breeze. Her gloves were mended, and her boots bore the soft scuffs of use. She had chosen this look with care, not to appear pitiful, but to appear useful. Etienne did not offer her his arm as she stepped down. He merely stood, silent, beside the carriage, his profile sharp in the morning light. "This way," he said without flourish. He led her through the heavy oak doors into a stone-floored vestibule where the scent of smoke and lavender polish mingled with something colder. Grief, perhaps, though it had no name. A woman in her 50s, dressed in a dark housekeeper's gown, appeared from the hallway. Her hair was pinned tightly beneath a linen cap, and her face bore the firm neutrality of long service. "This is Madame Fournier," Etienne said. "She manages the household." Iseline curtsied gently. "It's a pleasure, madame." The housekeeper offered a nod, but no smile. Her gaze flicked to Etienne for confirmation, then returned to Iseline. "You'll be in the East Wing," he said. "It's quieter." She wanted to ask what he meant by quieter, but thought better of it. Instead, she followed Madame Fournier through a long corridor lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. One painting in particular, a woman in a sapphire gown, her hair the color of dark honey, caught her attention. Her beauty was soft, but her expression was resolute, even mournful. "That was Madame Carrière," the housekeeper said without turning. "The late mistress." Iseline lowered her eyes. "She was very beautiful. She was beloved." No more was said. The room assigned to her was modest but clean. A simple bed, a writing table, a wooden wardrobe. A single window overlooked the vineyard slopes and the workers below, already gathering to begin pruning the sleeping vines. The silence in the room was thick, not oppressive, but thoughtful, like the silence of a chapel. Madame Fournier placed a small lamp on the table and handed her a folded towel. "There is warm water in the pitcher. You will find breakfast in the kitchen at 8. We ring the bell only once." "Thank you," Iseline replied softly. When the door closed behind her, she exhaled. Alone, safe, and yet far from at ease. Later that morning, she explored the estate grounds under a sun that remained veiled by thin clouds. The vineyards rolled in graceful curves down the hillsides, their symmetry broken only by the occasional olive tree or boundary wall. Men worked in steady rhythm, with pruning shears and quiet conversation. The scent of damp wood and cut vine lingered in the air. She watched from a distance, her gloved hands folded. She had grown up in the city, surrounded by ships and ledgers, not grapes and clay. But something about the land called to her, its resilience, its discipline, its quiet demands. Etienne appeared beside her with the same silence he always carried. He had changed into his work attire, a linen shirt open at the collar, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a brown wool vest dusted with dried soil. There was no pretense to him here, only earth and purpose. "Have you ever worked a vineyard?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, but I would like to learn." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in her tone. "Madame Fournier will find you suitable gloves." And with that, he turned and walked back toward the vines. The servants spoke little to her. Some nodded curtly, others avoided eye contact altogether. It was clear that word of her arrival had carried more than just her name. Whispers traveled faster than horses in a place like this, and gossip lingered like wine stains on linen. Only the boy, Julian, observed her openly, from a distance. She saw him by the olive tree near the dovecote, a book forgotten in his lap. his wide eyes filled with something unreadable. When she smiled at him, he vanished behind the stone wall like a shadow. That night, Iseline sat at the writing desk in her room and penned a letter. To my dearest Aimé and Claude, I am safe. I am somewhere the world cannot find me for now. Do not worry, I have not been harmed. I think of you every moment and will write again when I can. Be good to Madame Dupré, pray for Papa, and remember, I did this for us. All my love, Iseline. She sealed the letter and placed it beneath her pillow. Tomorrow she would ask the maid to post it with the morning bread delivery. The days that followed settled into a rhythm not unlike that of the land itself. At dawn, she joined the workers, listening carefully, mimicking their techniques. Her fingers ached, her back protested, but she did not complain. Sweat became her shield, labor her dignity. Etienne spoke little but observed much. When she clipped too far from a node, he corrected her. When she protected a weak root from a careless boot, he nodded. They did not share stories, they shared glances, short ones, heavy ones. In the evenings, she returned to her room and soaked her hands in warm lavender water. The silence of the chateau grew more familiar, more bearable. She began to hear the small sounds, the creak of floorboards, the hiss of the hearth, the whisper of vines bending in the wind. But at night, when the lamp was extinguished and her body stilled beneath the quilt, her mind wandered. She thought of her mother's soft songs, of her father's trembling hands, of Desfleur's eyes. But most often, she thought of Etienne Carrière, the way his brow furrowed when he listened, the way he avoided the grand salon where his wife's portrait hung. One evening, she entered the salon by mistake while seeking a book. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house. The fire had long been removed from the hearth. The curtains remained drawn. She lit a lamp, only to find herself face to face with the portrait once again. Madame Carrière looked back at her, eternal and composed. Iseline whispered, "I mean no harm." She did not stay long. That night, as she walked past the boy's chamber, she heard a quiet sob. She paused, uncertain. A soft knock. No reply. She opened the door gently. Julien sat upright in bed, his face blotched with tears, the candle beside him flickering weakly. "I had a dream," he murmured. She stepped in, cautious. "Would you like me to sit with you for a moment?" He nodded. She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "Was it about your mother?" she asked softly. He nodded again, more slowly this time. "She used to sing when it rained." Outside, the wind began to howl. "I can stay until it passes," Iseline said. He reached out, tentative, unsure, and took her hand. His fingers were small, cold. She closed hers around them gently. When Etienne passed the open door minutes later, he stopped. The scene before him, his son comforted by a woman not born of this land, not chosen, not expected, rooted him to the floor. He did not enter, he did not speak, but something deep within him shifted, like soil warming beneath a late frost, and though he would not say it aloud, not yet, he knew that Chateau Carrière had begun to breathe again. In Bordeaux, no secret remained secret for long, especially not one wrapped in mystery and bound in silence. The presence of a young woman, unmarried, unchaperoned, and with no surname worth repeating, living under the roof of a widowed vintner known for his isolation, did not go unnoticed. By the end of the second week, it was no longer a whisper. It was a conversation, murmured over garden gates, traded in perfumed parlors, and savored in the drawing rooms of women who adored scandal almost as much as imported lace. At the center of it all was Iseline Marchand, though her name was seldom spoken aloud. Instead, she became the girl at Carrière, the former merchant's daughter, the ruin paid in coin. Each title robbed her of her humanity and replaced it with myth, and the one who fed that fire with deliberate cruelty and impeccable timing was Armand Desfleurs. He told the tale with care, never explicitly, a raised brow at a dinner party, a slow sip of wine followed by, "Well, I suppose each man has his tastes, even in damaged goods." He let the silence do most of the work. And Bordeaux, hungry for distraction, devoured every insinuation. Isaline remained unaware at first. Life at the chateau was steady, even serene. The vineyard demanded attention, the boy had begun to offer quiet smiles, and Etienne, though still distant, had ceased to look at her as if she were a burden. She began to believe, perhaps foolishly, that the world had left her alone. Until the auction. It was held in a grand hall near the Place de la Comédie, a semi-annual affair where vintners and merchants gathered to sample, judge, and invest in the future of wine. Etienne had not attended in years, but this time he received a personal invitation sealed with the crest of the Aubert family, a name that even time dared not forget. "I think it would be wise for you to come," he said to Isaline as they stood beneath the budding grapevines. "You've worked the field. You deserve to see the result." She hesitated. "Will they mind my presence?" His eyes met hers. "Let them." She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of soft plum wool with a modest neckline and gloves that bore faint stitches from repair. She pinned her hair in a braided crown, adding a ribbon of faded silk. There was no jewel at her throat, only her mother's locket. They entered together, the room already thick with perfume and opinion. The chandeliers shimmered above their heads, casting prisms across silk gowns and tailored coats. Silver trays passed between conversations, and violins played with the indifference of those too refined to acknowledge sorrow. Isaline kept close to Etienne's side, offering a polite smile to those who dared meet her gaze. Most did not. She heard it before she saw them. Two women, draped in velvet and adorned with feathers, speaking in hushed tones near the glassware. "Imagine the disgrace," one murmured, "brought into his home like that, and her father a known gambler. She must be clever with her hands, or something else." Laughter followed, gentle, practiced and sharp enough to draw blood. Isaline's breath caught. Her fingers curled slightly around the clutch of her glove. She turned her face away, only to catch another pair of eyes watching her. A gentleman with a trimmed beard and cruel smile. His gaze lingered far too long, then drifted lower, mocking. The humiliation was not shouted, it did not need to be. It was performed, in sidelong glances, in the way people stood just far enough from her, in the silence that followed her every step. And then she saw Desfleur, standing beside a magistrate, swirling a glass of red as if it were ink. His expression was calm, almost amused. He raised his glass slightly in her direction. Not a toast, a warning. It was too much. Isaline turned and fled, through the corridor, past the statue of Bacchus, out into the shadowed street where the lamps flickered in the early dusk. The wind caught her cloak, and the sound of her boots against the cobblestone echoed with urgency. She did not see Etienne until he caught her by the arm. Isaline. She could not look at him, not like this. Not while her dignity lay in ruins at her feet. "I shouldn't have come," she said, her voice breaking. "They've painted me into something I cannot erase." Etienne's jaw clenched. He had always been a man of stillness, of words chosen like vines in harvest. But something inside him, something buried too long, ignited. "Come back with me," he said. "Now." When they re-entered the hall, the chatter dimmed. People turned, poised for spectacle. Desfleur smiled wider, ready to claim his moment of triumph. Etienne stepped forward. His voice was not raised, but it did not need to be. "I have heard enough," he said. "Enough whispers, enough poison, enough cowardice disguised as courtesy." The room stilled. Glasses froze mid-air. "You speak of honor while hiding behind fans and smiles," he continued. "You speak of virtue while feasting on the suffering of others. Let me tell you something you've forgotten in your decadence. Isaline Marchand is under my protection. She is a woman of dignity, of courage. And not one of you is worthy to unlace her boots, let alone judge the path she walks." A gasp, a murmur. Desfleur opened his mouth, but the interruption came not from Etienne, but from a woman near the front row. Madame Céline Aubert, widowed at 29, owner of 3 vineyards, and the patroness of Bordeaux's most powerful charitable circles. She wore midnight blue silk and a sapphire brooch that had once belonged to a duchess. Her voice cut through the air with gentle command. "Etienne is right," she said, "and if your tongues were half as refined as your wine, you'd see the truth plainly." She crossed the room and took Iseline's hand. "I have known wolves and widows, saints and sinners," she said, her eyes never leaving de Fleur. "And I know when a woman carries her suffering with grace. Let her be." The silence that followed was not empty. It was changed. The rest of the evening passed in uneasy quiet. When Iseline and Etienne returned to the chateau, neither spoke for some time. In the vestibule, as she removed her gloves, he said softly, "You do not have to stay." She turned to him. "I want to," she said, "not because I am afraid to leave, but because I am tired of running." Their eyes met. There was no need for more, not yet. But the seed had been planted, rooted not in lust, not in gratitude, but in something far more dangerous, respect. By the time June settled over Bordeaux, the vines at Chateau Carrière had shaken off their winter sleep. Leaves unfurled with urgency, the green of them sharp against the golden hue of the soil, and the air grew thick with the scent of sun-warmed earth and wild lavender carried in from the hills. The estate, once silent and heavy with mourning, began to breathe again, not loudly, not joyfully, but rhythmically, like a body slowly returning to life after a long illness. And at the heart of it moved Iseline. Each morning she walked the rows of vines with sleeves rolled and hair pinned in a soft crown, her hands stained with sap, her dress marked with dust. The labor brought a quiet pride, tangible proof that she belonged not because she had been given a room, but because she had earned her place among the rows and roots. The workers no longer glanced at her with suspicion. Some even nodded in greeting. A few, mostly older men, began to offer quiet tips, which knots to snip, which vines to bind early, which corners of the vineyard held stubborn soil. Iseline listened. She always listened. And Etienne Carrière watched. He did not hover. He never intruded. But often at the edge of the vineyard or beside the stone path leading to the olive grove, he stood with arms folded, gaze narrowed, not in disapproval, but in contemplation. There was something in the way she moved, unhurried, purposeful, unafraid, that disturbed the order he had so carefully constructed around his grief. She was not his guest. She was not his servant. She was something else entirely. It was on one of those golden afternoons, when the vineyard hummed with bees and distant birdsong, that the quiet broke. Julien had been playing near the low wall that bordered the edge of the southern slope. A boyish attempt to balance, to race along the stone like a tightrope walker, ended in a cry that sliced through the vineyard like a blade. Iseline was closest. She ran. She found him sprawled on the ground, his leg bent at a strange angle, tears mixing with dust on his cheeks. "Don't move," she said gently, kneeling beside him. "I've got you." He clung to her, his small fingers curling into her sleeve. She called out to a passing worker who ran for help, and soon Etienne appeared, pale, breathless, eyes wide with panic. "He fell," she explained. "The leg." Etienne dropped beside his son. "Julien, look at me." The boy whimpered, then blinked, then whispered, "It hurts, Papa." Etienne swallowed hard. "I know." Together they lifted him carefully and carried him back to the chateau. Iseline held the boy's hand the entire way, whispering soothing nonsense, fragments of lullabies, promises of warm milk, of stories by the fire. Madame Fournier summoned the physician, who confirmed the leg was not broken, but badly twisted. Julien would need rest, elevation, and care. That evening, long after the doctor had left and Etienne had retired to his study in silence, Iseline entered Julien's room carrying a bowl of warm water and a cloth steeped in herbs. The boy blinked up at her from his pillows. "Will you stay with me again?" She nodded. "Until you fall asleep." She sat beside him, cleaning the scrapes on his palms, humming quietly. His fingers found hers again, and the grip was tighter this time, not from fear, but from trust. She remained until his breathing deepened, until the lines on his brow softened. It was then that Etienne appeared at the doorway. He did not speak. He simply stood there watching her, this woman who had arrived in silence and shame, who now sat like a sentinel beside his son, her posture soft, her presence undeniable. Something cracked inside him, something long buried, and that frightened him more than he could admit. He stepped into the room, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." Iseline looked up. "It's nothing." "No," he said. "It isn't." For a moment, their eyes met across the soft flicker of candlelight. Her gaze held no expectation, only calm. His held too much, grief, confusion, a yearning he refused to name. He took a step back, then another, and left. She watched the doorway long after he was gone. Later that week, while returning a book to the library, a room she had not yet truly explored, Iseline found herself drawn to the far corner where the light was weakest. Rows of ledgers, records, and journals lined the shelves, many bound in faded leather, their spines crumbling. She reached for a volume that had slipped behind the others. As she pulled it free, something fell from behind the stack, a flat object wrapped in linen. Curious, she unwrapped it. It was a small portrait, no larger than a letter. The brushstrokes were delicate, the background a blur of blue and grey, but the face was unmistakable. The same woman she had seen in the grand salon, but here, younger, softer, smiling. And in her eyes the exact shape and color of Julian's, there was joy. Iseline exhaled slowly. This was not just a portrait. This was memory, loss, devotion. She rewrapped it carefully, returning it behind the ledgers where it had been hidden. Not because she feared Etienne's anger, but because she understood that grief was not something one banished. It was something one carried. That night, when Etienne joined her briefly by the fire after dinner, their conversation was light. Weather, harvest, soil. But beneath the words lay something else, not passion, not yet, but the beginning of recognition, not of what had been lost, but of what might just barely be found. The scent of roses clung to the air as summer pressed upon Chateau Carrière with golden fingers. The vines, heavy with green clusters still shy of ripeness, rustled softly beneath the breeze. Birds dipped low over the fields in lazy arcs, and from the kitchen, the hum of midday preparations drifted through open windows. All seemed peaceful. But peace, as Iseline was learning, could be deceptive. She was returning from the olive grove, her skirts lightly dusted with earth, her cheeks flushed with the exertion of pruning when she saw the carriage. It stood in the courtyard like a creature out of place, sleek, black, and gleaming. Its coat of arms, a golden fleur-de-lis nestled in a cluster of grapes, was familiar in the worst way. A man stepped down before the driver could assist. His cane struck the stone with polished arrogance. His waistcoat gleamed with embroidery too fine for the countryside. Armand de Fleur. The sight of him rooted Iseline where she stood. Her breath caught not from surprise, but from the resurgence of dread, a feeling she had pushed far below the surface. He saw her, smiled, not kindly. "There you are," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "Still playing the farmer's muse, I see." She did not move. "You are not welcome here." "Ah," he replied, stepping closer, his voice smooth as oil. "But I've come with a gift." She stiffened. "I want nothing from you." "But you misunderstand me, mademoiselle." He lowered his voice, though they were alone in the yard. "I come with the most generous of intentions. I have reconsidered your situation, and I have reached a conclusion most favorable to all parties." She narrowed her eyes. "Speak plainly. I will marry you." The words struck like thunder in a clear sky. "I beg your pardon?" "I will marry you," he repeated as if discussing whether. "Legally, publicly, elegantly. Your name restored, your reputation salvaged. You will have a home, security, and the admiration of those who once mocked you. And I, in turn, will have something quite valuable indeed. You." redeemed by my generosity. A silence fell between them, but it was not empty. It burned with disbelief, with fury, with the crushing weight of insult, masked as benevolence. Isoline's voice trembled, but only slightly. You seek to possess what you could not destroy. Defleur's smile faded. I offer you salvation, and you speak of destruction. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. You think yourself kind, offering marriage after slandering me, after spreading filth, after trying to buy what no man deserves. You are not my savior. You are the architect of my shame. His expression darkened. The false charm slipped like a mask, cracked at the edges. Then allow me to correct your understanding, mademoiselle. You have no name left. You walk under borrowed roofs and dine on borrowed decency. Bordeaux may forget the whispers, but the letter will remain. Her breath faltered. What letter? He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a folded sheet and held it just beyond her reach. A copy, of course. The original rests comfortably with the magistrate. A letter, allegedly written by you, confessing that you fled your father's home in disgrace, that you were no longer fit to bear the Marchand name, that you sought refuge in vice, not virtue. Isoline stared at the parchment as if it might catch fire between them. You forged it. Who will say otherwise? He replied too softly. Your father, buried in debt and drink, the child you comfort, the widower who lets you sleep beneath his roof. His voice lowered to a whisper. Think carefully, my dear. This vineyard is not immune to scandal. One drop of poison in a barrel ruins the whole cask. Marry me, and all is forgotten. Decline, and you take down everything and everyone with you. A door opened behind them. Etienne. He had heard enough. He crossed the courtyard in long, deliberate strides, his presence filling the space like a gathering storm. He did not raise his voice. He did not break into rage, but his stillness was more terrifying than thunder. You will leave, he said to Defleur, his voice low. Now. Defleur turned with the sickening smile of a man who believes himself invincible. Etienne, how unfortunate. I had hoped we might reach a civil understanding. I do not reach understanding with liars. Careful, Defleur said, tipping his hat. Accusations have consequences. Etienne's jaw clenched. So do trespasses. Defleur looked at Isoline, then back at Etienne. Very well, I'll go. But do remember what I said. Bordeaux is not so forgiving, and her name, he nodded at Isoline, carries no weight anymore. Only scandal. He turned, climbed into his carriage, and was gone. Silence remained in his wake. Isoline stood motionless, her hands shaking, her face pale with fury and shame. Etienne moved toward her, but she lifted a hand, not to stop him, but to gather breath. He forged a letter, she said. He's made it public. He nodded once. I will speak to the magistrate, to the council, to anyone who... No. Her voice cut cleanly. He looked at her, startled. She turned to him, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed smaller, not weaker, but stripped bare. I cannot let this ruin you, she whispered. Your name, your estate, your son. His brow furrowed. Isoline, you've done enough for me. She stepped back. Too much. And now you're at the edge of losing everything because of what I brought through your doors. Emotion twisted in his expression, something between protest and anguish. I do not regret, but I do, she said barely above her breath. Not you, never you, but the pain I've brought into this place. I can't stay and let it fester. He took a step closer. You're not a burden. She smiled sadly. You're kind. But we both know that kindness will not stop gossip, or council decisions, or letters sealed in official ink. Night fell quickly that evening. The sky turned purple with stormlight. Long after the household quieted, Isoline stood at the foot of her bed, a small satchel open beside her. She packed only what she had brought, no more, no less. She left the locket, but tucked inside was the letter she had written weeks before to her siblings. At dawn, she left without waking anyone. No goodbye, only silence, and the scent of roses fading behind her. The land near the Garonne River bore a humbler face than the hills of Château Carrière. The vines were planted without symmetry, the soil more wild than tamed. The house was small, its shutters weathered, and its walls carried the scent of wood smoke and damp clay. But there was something kind in its disorder, something honest. It was there, in the quiet cradle of that modest vineyard, that Isaline Marchand sought refuge. She had arrived before dawn, cloaked in the blue of the early sky, her satchel light, her name unspoken. The family who owned the land, the Duvals, did not ask questions. They had seen enough of life to recognize when a woman wished not to explain herself. In exchange for shelter and meals, Isaline offered her hands and worked them until they blistered. She slept in a small room above the granary, beneath a slanted roof that let in the songs of birds at dawn and the sigh of the wind at dusk. Her mattress was thin, her mirror no more than polished tin. Yet there, stripped of expectation, of stares, of whispered names, she rediscovered something she had not felt in weeks: stillness. Each morning, she tied her hair back with a ribbon cut from the lining of her mother's locket, the only piece of her past she had carried. The ribbon was pale blue, nearly grey now from wear, but it held the scent of dried lavender and memory. It gave her courage. In the evenings, she wrote. Not confessions, not apologies, only love. Her letters to her siblings were short, filled with simple promises that she was well, that she was safe, that the river nearby reminded her of the Garonne they used to watch from the school windows, and that when the time came, she would return. Not ruined, but stronger, they wrote back on crumpled paper, the handwriting wobbly and dear. Claude had taken to polishing boots for the neighbor's son. Aimee had learned to sew a straight hem. They missed her. They prayed for her, they were proud. These letters became her breath, and yet he remained in her thoughts. Etienne. Not always in words, nor in images, but in feeling. A weight in her chest, a tremor in her hands when the wind smelled of grapes and firewood. She would wake in the dark and think she had heard Julien's laughter below the stairs. But Château Carrière was no longer hers to think of. She had chosen exile, and exile demanded silence. Still, fate has a cruel love for unfinished stories. As summer waned, preparations for the harvest festival began. In the region, the celebration was both sacred and defiant, a final joy before the vines were stripped, before the work of crushing and fermenting began. A last sunlit breath before the darker days. The Duvals brought their wines to the gathering, along with jars of preserved cherries and baskets of sweet bread. Isaline helped carry the crates, her hands steady, her eyes lowered. The festival unfolded in a clearing near the riverbank, where garlands of oak leaves crowned wooden archways and fiddlers played beneath canvas tents. Children darted between tables, their fingers sticky with honey. Lanterns swung from poles, their glow growing stronger as the sun began to slip, and among it all, laughter, clinking glasses, the scent of roasted chestnuts and cider. He walked in, Etienne Carrière, dressed simply, as always. A dark waistcoat, a linen shirt open at the collar. The sleeves rolled, the cuffs faintly stained from labor, but his face, there was no peace in it. His eyes moved over the crowd with quiet intensity, his posture a wire drawn tight. He had not come for wine. He had not come for music. He had come for her. Isaline did not move. She stood behind a stack of barrels near the edge of the clearing, her breath caught between the ribs of memory and fear. And then he saw her. His gaze locked with hers from across the field, across the noise and the firelight and the revelers dancing to a waltz. He did not smile. She did not cry. But the world narrowed. Everything, the music, the movement, the autumn wind, it all fell away. There was only that look, a look not of surprise, but of recognition. She turned before he could cross the distance. Her hands trembled as she slipped behind the tent, heart pounding like a drum under siege. Not now, not here. Not with the past rushing forward like a tide, but Etienne did not follow. He did not need to. That moment, brief as it was, had planted something unshakable, a knowing, a flame reignited in a heart that had not yet learned how to forget. Back at the vineyard, Etienne returned to the chateau in silence. Julien had waited for him on the steps, a candle flickering beside his knees, his small frame wrapped in a shawl far too large. "Did you find her?" he asked. Etienne knelt beside him. "I saw her. Will she come back?" The man who had once lost everything, who had walked through grief and kept walking, closed his eyes. "I don't know," he said. But his voice no longer sounded uncertain. It sounded like hope. The morning broke with a sky washed in rose and slate, the mist still clinging low across the rows of vines, like a breath withheld. The air was cool, but not cold, a gentle warning that summer was fading, and the earth, ever faithful, was preparing to surrender its fruit. At the edge of a modest vineyard near the Garonne, Isaline Marchand worked with quiet precision. Her hands, gloveless, moved along the tendrils of a stubborn vine, trimming the leaves with a care that came not from habit, but from presence. There was peace in repetition, in the hum of morning insects in the moist soil beneath her boots. She welcomed the silence, even if it sometimes pressed too tightly against her thoughts. And then, footsteps, firm, measured, familiar. She did not turn. She knew. He stopped just behind her, far enough not to impose, close enough to command the air between them. "Isaline!" The sound of her name, spoken with such weight, fractured the shield she had built around herself. Slowly, she stood. Her braid was loose from the early labor, a few strands clinging to her flushed cheeks. The morning light caught the flecks of earth on her dress, the curve of her lashes, the steady tremble of her breath. She faced him. Etienne Carrière looked as she remembered, perhaps wearier, perhaps with more shadow under his eyes, but the same, rooted in silence, rooted in something deeper than words. "You came," she said, and her voice was not a whisper, but a truth spoken gently. He did not move closer. "You left without a word." "I was trying to protect you." The words came too easily, as if they had waited at the edge of her tongue since the morning she vanished. "From what?" he asked, his voice tight. "From gossip? From consequence? You're not the cause of either." She shook her head. "I was the excuse, and Des Fleurs made sure of that. If I had stayed, he would have twisted every kindness you showed me into poison. You could have lost your land, your name. Julien." Etienne stepped forward. "And I lost you instead." The stillness that followed was not empty, it was electric. Her fingers curled at her sides. His hands remained clenched. "I thought," he said slowly, "that if I kept my distance, if I held back, it would spare us both." Her eyes shimmered. "Did it?" He looked at her then, not in passing, not from afar, but fully, as if her face were the vineyard itself, as if every line, every bruise, every freckle were something sacred. "No," he said, "it didn't." She could not breathe. "I tried not to love you," he continued, his voice breaking with restraint. "But I failed." The admission cracked the air. He reached out, slowly, as if unsure whether he still had the right. She met him halfway. Their hands touched, rough from labor, trembling from honesty. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist. Her breath caught. She looked up, and in that shared gaze was everything neither had dared say aloud. No urgency, no desperation, only reverence. When his lips found hers, it was not a claim. It was a confession, a kiss, without hunger, yet full of need, of recognition, of surrender. It lasted only moments, but in it lived seasons, loss, resilience, hope. When they pulled apart, they remained close, her forehead resting gently against his chest. His hand cradled the back of her neck. The morning sun climbed higher, but neither noticed. "I can't go back," she murmured. He held her tighter. "Then let me bring you forward." They returned to Chateau Carrière just before midday. The journey was made in silence, save for the occasional glance, the brush of fingers, the knowing that neither was walking alone anymore. At the estate, the servants stared, but not in scorn. Madame Fournier, ever composed, nodded subtly and gave orders for a second place to be set for lunch. The tension that had once filled the hallways seemed to melt into the beams of light now cutting through the windows. By evening, a small supper had been arranged. Not grand, not formal, but intimate. A quiet gathering of allies, among them Madame Céline Aubert. She arrived wrapped in violet silk and adorned with garnets, her cane tapping softly against the stone as she entered. Her sharp eyes found Iseline at once. "Well," she said, her voice low and smooth as aged wine, "it seems I was right about you." Iseline rose, her pulse quickening. Madame Aubert stepped closer and without ceremony kissed her cheek. "I do hope you plan to stay. Bordeaux could use a few more women who remember what dignity looks like." The supper unfolded with calm conversation and clinking glasses. The wine was from an older vintage, chosen deliberately by Etienne. The candles flickered low, their light reflecting off polished silver and soft smiles. When the guests departed and the last dish was cleared, Iseline wandered the quiet halls, drawn by memory, by the pulse of a house that no longer felt foreign. She paused at the door of the salon, the room that had once belonged to ghosts. Inside, the fire burned low, the portrait still hung above the mantel. Etienne entered behind her, his steps soft. He said nothing at first. Then, "I never knew what to do with her memory." "She loved you," Iseline said gently. "Yes." His voice cracked. "And I loved her. But love should not become a prison." She turned to him. "It never was. You were simply waiting for someone who would not replace her, but walk beside her memory." His eyes shone, and before he could speak, he crossed to the mantel. With deliberate care, he removed the portrait, holding it for a long moment before turning toward the door. "Help me bring her to the archive," he said. Together, they carried her, past the dining room, past the corridor where Julian had once sobbed in his sleep, to a room filled with books and ledgers and history. They placed the portrait among the others. She did not disappear. She became part of the whole, a chapter, not the ending. That night, in the quiet of the drawing room, with moonlight painting silver across the stone floor, Etienne and Iseline sat side by side, not touching, not speaking, simply breathing in the peace they had both fought to earn. The vineyard would need tending come morning, but for now there was only this, the truth and the heart that had finally come home. The wind changed that night. It swept down from the northern hills with a dry breath that did not belong to summer's end, carrying with it a whisper that stirred the vines and trembled through the shutters of Chateau Carrière. Iseline felt it first. In the stillness before sleep, something not quite right in the air, something brittle and sharp. She had just snuffed her lamp when the scent reached her, faint but unmistakable. Smoke. She sat up, and then shouts. Not the ordinary murmurs of the night crew, nor the restless groan of cattle in the lower fields. No, these were cries that tore through the quiet like fabric ripping. Urgent, terrified. She flung the door open, her bare feet hitting the cold stone floor. In the hallway, light flickered from torches hastily lit. A maid screamed from the back stairwell. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. "Fire!" someone shouted. "The western slope is burning." She did not hesitate. She grabbed her shawl, wrapped it tight around her shoulders, and ran. Outside, the night sky had turned crimson in the west. Flames licked at the rows of vines near the olive grove, their light feral and unnatural. Sparks leapt into the air, riding the wind like messengers of ruin. Smoke billowed low, thickening the air with every breath. Etienne was already there, sleeves rolled, boots soaked, barking orders. His voice was clear, unyielding. A man who had known disaster before and would not let it win again. Form a chain, water from the well to the barrels, protect the inner rows. Julian stood near the stables, pale and barefoot, clutching a blanket. When he saw Iseline, he ran to her. "I tried to wake you," he said between gasps. "Papa said to stay inside, but I couldn't. I couldn't just wait." She held him for a breath, then crouched to meet his eyes. "Stay by the well," she said. "You'll help pass buckets. That's how you can protect the vines. That's how you can help your father." He nodded bravely and darted toward the line forming in the yard. Iseline followed the orange light. She reached the edge of the blaze where the workers, half-dressed, soot-streaked, fought with buckets and soaked cloths, some hacking branches to beat back the flames. The fire had devoured 4 rows already. It roared like a living thing. Etienne saw her. "Stay back," he warned. "I can help," she replied. He didn't argue. They worked side by side, passing buckets from hand to hand, drenching roots, dousing leaves. The vineyard was no longer a place of peace. It was a battlefield, and every vine was a soldier they refused to surrender. Then a scream from deeper within the smoke. "Jacques is trapped," someone cried. Etienne didn't wait. "Where?" "Near the old wall. He ran to cut a fire break and the wind changed." "Get him out," Etienne ordered. But no one moved. The flames had surged there, too high now, too fast. "I said, I'll go," Etienne snapped, and before anyone could stop him, he was gone. Iseline shouted his name, but the fire swallowed her voice. She ran after him until the heat stopped her. The smoke stung her eyes, choked her breath. All she could do was wait and pray. It felt like hours. In truth, it was moments. Then through the shifting smoke, a figure emerged. Etienne, dragging a boy half his size, both coughing, stumbling, blackened with ash. Etienne's arm was torn and bleeding, his coat scorched along the shoulder. The workers swarmed to help. The boy was pulled to safety. Etienne collapsed to one knee. Iseline reached him. "You're hurt," she said, taking his face in her hands. "I'm fine." "You're not." He didn't argue. Together they walked, slowly, painfully, back toward the main house. The fire behind them was finally dying, beaten back by sweat, grit, and desperation. The vineyard had survived, but not unscarred. Inside, Madame Fournier had prepared linens and hot water. Etienne sat on the edge of the table, silent as Iseline cut away the burnt fabric of his sleeve. His skin beneath was raw, angry with blisters. She worked gently. Her hands did not tremble. He watched her through half-lidded eyes. "You shouldn't have come to the fire. And you shouldn't have run into it," she said, voice trembling with restrained fury. "But we both did." A silence passed between them. Not cold, heavy with the truth that their lives were no longer separate threads. "Is the boy all right?" She nodded. "You saved him." Etienne exhaled. Then it was worth it. Later that morning, while Etienne rested, a knock echoed through the hall. A young vineyard boy, Mathieu, no older than 14, stood at the threshold, clutching a crumpled envelope. "I need to speak with Monsieur Carrière," he said. "It's about the fire." Iseline led him in. Etienne opened his eyes as the boy stepped forward. "It wasn't an accident," Mathieu said. "I saw the man. He wasn't from the estate. I heard him say something about a lesson for the vintner. I followed him after, I know where he went." Etienne sat upright, despite the pain. "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir. He's hiding near the docks. I can take the magistrate there." Iseline reached for her shawl. "I'll go with him." "Iseline," Etienne began, "you can't go, and this must be done quickly." He met her eyes and saw again that she was no longer a guest in his life. She was part of it. Within the hour, Magistrate Renou had the confession. The man, a vagrant paid in coin and wine, had little to lose. He named Armand de Fleur without hesitation, said he was promised a bag of gold for setting a fire no one could trace. But someone had traced it. Iseline stood before the Bordeaux Merchant Council 2 days later, flanked by Madame Aubert and Madame Fournier, who both gave testimony to de Fleur's harassment. De Fleur arrived with bravado. He left in disgrace, stripped of his privileges, shunned from the guild, his holdings frozen, his reputation, once polished like brass, now rusted beyond repair. Justice, at last, had found him. Back at the chateau, Etienne recovered slowly. The wound would scar, but the vineyard would grow again. And as Iselin sat beside him, reading aloud by the open window, her fingers grazing his uninjured hand, the truth was clear. She was no longer a shadow in his life. She was his equal, not because she had earned it, but because she had always been. Autumn swept through Bordeaux with a grace that made even the wind feel sacred. The air turned crisp and golden, scented with ripe figs, crushed leaves, and the final breath of grapes that had surrendered their sweetness to the press. Across the hills, the vines curled into rust and amber, their branches weary but noble, their work for the season done. At Château Carrière, the harvest had passed, and with it, the final shadows of a bitter summer. What remained was quieter, deeper, a peace that did not erase pain, but honored its place in the story. On a morning brushed with mist and warmed by the low sun, Iselin Marchand walked through the vineyard arm in arm with Etienne Carrière, and between them Julien, his small fingers wrapped around theirs. They walked slowly, not to admire the view, they had seen it too often for that, but to feel it, the crunch of soil beneath their boots, the scent of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys, the hush of vines at rest. Julien darted ahead, chasing a falling leaf, and Etienne let out a soft chuckle. Iselin turned toward him, her face lit by the golden light that filtered through the thinning canopy above. "You smile more now," she said, her voice gentle. "I have reason to," he replied. She looked out across the fields. "It feels like the land is watching us, as if it knows." He nodded. "It does. The earth remembers everything." Iselin stopped walking. "And you? Do you remember everything too?" Etienne turned toward her. "Not everything, only what matters." His hand found hers, and though the wind swept past them, she felt warm. Later that afternoon, the chateau was dressed in finery rarely seen since the days of Madame Carrière. The halls were polished, the fireplaces lit, and the long table in the dining room was adorned with late roses, chestnuts, and gold-rimmed china. Madame Céline Aubert had sent fresh linens and Bordeaux crystal from her own estate, declaring that dignity must be celebrated or it will learn to live in silence. The occasion was not a ball nor a formal banquet, but a gathering of chosen hearts, those who had stood by the vineyard not just in harvest, but in hardship. Madame Aubert arrived first, as always, her cane tapping with purpose. She greeted Iselin with a kiss to the cheek and a look that held nothing but pride. "I knew from the first moment that you were not what they said you were," she whispered. "I hope I've proven that," Iselin replied. "You've proven more," Madame Aubert said. "You've reminded Bordeaux of what a woman truly is." Then came Madame Fournier, freshly pressed and stern as ever, though her eyes softened as she presented a gift. An embroidered linen cloth bearing the Carrière crest, hand-stitched by the maids. "We thought it belonged in the new mistress's kitchen," she said simply. Even the workers came, some in borrowed coats, some with freshly scrubbed hands, all with glances of shy admiration. They had seen Iselin carry water, prune vines, cradle the boy who now called her friend, and then the surprise she had not dared to hope for. From the far end of the lane, two small figures approached on foot. The carriage had left them at the crossroads, and they had insisted on walking the rest of the way. Aimé and Claude Marchand. Iselin rose from her place at the table and ran to them, her eyes blurring with tears. Aimé flung herself into her arms, and Claude, now taller, stood awkwardly before breaking into a grin. "You wrote you were happy," Claude said, "but I didn't know it meant this." She pulled him close, her arms around both of them. "I didn't know it either. Not until it happened." From the doorway, Etienne watched. He did not interrupt. He waited until she looked up, until their eyes met. She stepped forward, bringing her siblings with her. Julien came too, slipping his hand into Claude's, like he'd known him all his life. And then, before the gathered guests, Etienne lifted his glass. "I have no speech," he said. "No poetry. Only truth." He turned to Iselin. "Before this land was mine, it belonged to generations who bled for it. and I have done my part to honor that legacy. But no vine grows without water, no wine ripens without sun, and no man, no matter how strong, can call himself whole without the courage to let go of sorrow and welcome grace. He reached for her hand. Today, I wish to ask, before those we love, before this land, if you will walk it beside me, not as my guest, not as my shadow, but as my wife. Gasps fluttered across the room like bird wings. Iselin did not blink, did not hesitate. Yes, she said. The room erupted in applause, first gentle, then rising with emotion. Madame Aubert lifted her glass. Madame Fournier dabbed discreetly at the corner of her eye. The workers clapped, even whistled, and Julien turned to Claude, grinning with pride. He looked up at Iselin then, and in a voice steady and sure said, "Maman." She froze, and then dropped to her knees, tears streaking her cheeks, arms wrapping around him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, mon cœur." The wedding was held 3 days later, in the small stone chapel just beyond the vineyard gate, where the ivy curled around the bell tower and doves nested beneath the eaves. It was not lavish. There were no jewels, no imported silks. Iselin wore a gown made of repurposed linen and a wreath of dried grape leaves in her hair. Etienne wore his father's coat, brushed and mended, and a boutonniere of wild lavender. But the vows they spoke, soft, unwavering, were richer than gold. That evening, as the sun sank low over the fields, casting everything in a glow of bronze and honey, Iselin and Etienne walked arm in arm down the path between the vines. The leaves rustled in soft approval. Julien ran ahead, Aimé chasing him, Claude walking close behind. The house awaited them in the distance, its windows aglow, its doors wide open. And as the last light kissed the hills, Etienne turned to her. "You once said you came to pay a debt." Iselin nodded. "I remember." He smiled. "Now you've given me something no coin ever could." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I never wanted to belong to anyone," she said. "But with you, I belong to myself." Together, they walked on, not toward an ending, but toward a life neither of them had believed they could ever deserve. She had once been the price of a debt. Now, she was the heart of a legacy. Epilogue. 8 years later, the vineyard of Carrière had known war, drought, and loss. It had endured frost-bitten springs and blistering harvests, and still, year after year, it yielded fruit. Not because it was untouched by hardship, but because it had learned, through time and care, that roots run deeper when watered by love. On a soft afternoon in Bordeaux, with the sun low over the vines and the sky brushed in fading rose, Iselin Carrière stood at the edge of the field, her apron dusted with flour, a lock of silver-threaded chestnut hair escaping her braid. In her arms, she cradled a sleeping child, no more than 2 months old, her third. Behind her, the windows of the chateau glowed with firelight. The scent of stewed pears drifted from the kitchen. Laughter echoed across the courtyard, where a boy of 8 chased his elder brother, Julien, now 16, tall and sure-footed. His voice deepened, his eyes steady and bright. The boy he once was still lingered in his grin, but he no longer limped when he ran. Iselin smiled as she watched him. It had been 8 years since that autumn supper, since Etienne had taken her hand in front of Bordeaux's finest and called her not his guest, but his wife. 8 years since Julien had called her maman. She had once feared never to be called anything but ruined. Now she was called mother, vintner, mistress, madame, and in every name she had found herself. Etienne approached from the path, the leather of his boots dusty from the day's walk. His beard was streaked with grey now, and his shoulders no longer bore the same weight alone. He pressed a kiss to her temple before reaching for the baby, whom he cradled with reverent hands. "She has your mouth," he said softly, "and your silence," Iselin whispered with a smile. "She sleeps more than both her brothers combined. Then she must be a gift from the heavens." Their second son came bounding across the grass, cheeks flushed, eyes wild with delight. He shouted something about worms and dirt, and Etienne sighed with mock despair. Iseline laughed, warm and full, and for a moment it felt as though the world had paused to breathe in joy. But not all stories had ended so sweetly. Armand Desfleurs, disgraced, had fled Bordeaux under the shroud of scandal. For years, rumors persisted of his dealings in Marseille and Toulon, whispers of further schemes. But 3 years prior, word arrived of his death, alone, penniless, in a rented room. No one mourned, no grave bore his name. Men who build empires on fear, Madame Aubert once said, eventually drown in their own shadows. Madame Aubert herself had passed peacefully just last winter, wrapped in silk and surrounded by her favorite books. In her will, she left Iseline her collection of personal journals and a bottle of wine older than the Republic. The note attached read, "To the woman who reminded Bordeaux that nobility is not inherited, but lived." As the baby stirred, Etienne rocked her gently. "The vines are late this year," he murmured. Iseline nodded. "But they'll bloom. They always do." Behind them, the chateau bore new shutters, painted soft cream and sage. The nursery windows were open, and from the music room drifted the sound of Aimée, now a young woman, playing Etienne's late wife's piano. Iseline had once feared that name, that shadow. But now, the portrait of Madame Carrière stood in the salon, not hidden, not revered, simply remembered. Love had not erased the past. It had woven it into the present. Claude, too, had found a calling. He studied viticulture in Burgundy, returning each summer to help with harvest. He was quiet and patient like Etienne, but with Iseline's fire when he spoke of the land. Their lives were not free of hardship. The world beyond Carrière grew more restless each year, workers demanding rights, the wealthy clinging to privilege. But inside the vineyard walls, a new kind of legacy was growing, one not built on old names but on earned love and chosen family. That evening, as the sun melted into the hills, the family gathered for supper beneath the pergola. Julien poured wine with the gravity of a man, and Aimée teased him until he blushed. The younger boys giggled between bites of roasted vegetables, and Etienne, eyes creased with joy, lifted his glass. "To the ones we've lost," he said softly. "To the ones we've become," Iseline added, her gaze locked with his. And as they touched their glasses, as the vineyard shimmered under the first stars, a hush fell. Not silence, but the sound of time holding its breath, just long enough to remember. For once, she had been the price of a debt. Now she was the heart of a home that had learned, through fire and sorrow, how to love and how to endure. Sometimes love begins in the most unexpected of places, not with grand declarations, but with silent sacrifices. Not in ballrooms, but in vineyards and quiet kitchens, where dignity is defended one breath at a time. Iseline's story reminds us that we are not defined by the wounds of the past or the cruelty of others. We are shaped by the choices we make when no one is watching, by the courage to rise when the world turns its back, by the ability to love when we've been taught only to survive. Her journey, from shame to strength, from transaction to true love, is a testament to the quiet resilience that lives in all of us. And perhaps, just like the vines of Chateau Carrière, it's through fire and storm that we become who we're meant to be. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment below. Let us know, what did this romance mean to you? And if you made it all the way to the end, type the word legacy in the comments. That one word lets us know you're one of the brave souls who stayed with Iseline until her very last chapter. If you'd like to support the small team that brings these emotional journeys to life, we would be so grateful for a super thanks on YouTube in any amount that feels right to you. Your generosity helps us create more love stories like this one, filled with emotion, beauty, and meaning. And if a donation isn't possible for you now, know that simply sharing this video with a friend or someone who believes in second chances helps us more than you can imagine. Make sure to explore the other heart-stirring romances waiting for you in the video cards at the end. There's a whole world of passion, sacrifice, and timeless love just waiting to be discovered. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in stories that heal. And thank you for letting us walk this journey with you.